Hey guys, and welcome back to Team J's Classroom Fun. I am Jordan, and today I'm excited to talk to you a little bit more about hunting for teacher jobs. As I mentioned in my past video where I had 5 different tips for how to look for a teacher job, I have a lot of experience with this. We have, because of my husband's job, moved often. We've moved to different states, different places. I've done private school, public school. So I've been on the interviewing side many times of this job hunt. The other thing is at some of the schools I was at, I was actually an interviewer. So I was on the side of looking at resumes, sitting in on interviews, helping make decisions of who we think would be best for the school and things like that. So even though I'm not an HR or anything like that, I do have some experience and some background knowledge that I would like to share with you today. So today what I want to talk about is the actual interview itself. You've contacted the school, they're calling you in for an interview. One, in person is best. Now I know in this day and age with using Zoom and things like that, it's obviously an option. And like if you live in a different place than where you're interviewing, then it might be what you need to do because I've done that before. However, Zoom interviews or whatever web platform you use are always a little tricky because there's that awkward lag time. So when I lived in Texas and we were looking for jobs in Vegas, and same thing, Vegas for jobs in Arizona, I had to do online because I didn't live at the current place. So it was what it was. But it is a little weird because you have that awkward lag time of like, you say something and then they're like responding, but are they done? Are you done? And then it's also hard to get a feel, right? When you're live in the room with people, you can read body language. You can kind of see what's happening. You can feel the mood, which also helps in the interview process. So my first tip with this is to, if possible, try to do in-person interviews, okay? Next tip that I have, you want to think ahead a little bit of some of the questions they're going to be asking. Now, obviously every school, every district has things that are special to them, certain to them, and they have probably their own set of questions they use. But there are typically a few questions that people will ask. So let's talk through a few of them. One of the questions that I do see commonly asked is like, if I were to walk into your room during ELA or during your math block or during writing workshop, what would I see? So that's something you want to think about. If you're a new teacher, you haven't maybe had some of those opportunities because you've been doing what your mentor teacher's been doing, but you want to think about like, what do you want for your classroom? What would you want this to look like? Same thing if it's something you've been teaching before, what does it look like if they were to come into your room and see the literacy block or literacy stations or small groups? What would that look like? Another question that's typically asked is behavior management. As we know, behavior management is huge. So they will be asking you about like, what is your philosophy? What is your plan? How do you handle behaviors? Have you dealt with behaviors before? Sometimes in these situations, they'll even ask some like scenario type questions. Like if you have a student that does blah, 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 what would you do? So these are things just to kind of think a little bit about ahead of time. Like I said, I mean, you can't fully script the interview or anything like that. But these are questions you can think about just so you kind of have an idea of what you're going to say so that you don't go in and kind of get deer in the headlights. Next thing with that as well, another big one that I've seen at schools is parent involvement. This is typically a question that's asked. Now, obviously, every school and district has different things with this. Some schools have parents that are very involved. Some schools, maybe parents are not able to be as involved for whatever reason. And so this is typically a question. So oftentimes they'll be asking like, how are you going to involve parents in the classroom? How are you going to communicate with parents? So you want to think about like, okay, weekly newsletters. Are you going to invite them in for celebrations? Things like that are things you want to be thinking about ahead of time. Another thing, now this is something that I actually mentioned in my last video where I talked about tips for job hunting. Before you go into your interview, you want to research the school and the district. Every school and district typically has some things that make them different, that make them unique. And so you want to know ahead of time what that is. Are they really big into STEAM? Are they big into the science of reading? What are they big into? Because this then brings about some points that they might bring up or ask you about. Like maybe they have a special program and they're wondering, have you done this before? But it also will bring you up some talking points that you can use for questions, which I'll talk about in a second. As I also mentioned in my last video, even if they bring something up, like I know one of the places that I interviewed for, they have the special program they use, and they're like, hey, have you had experience with this? I hadn't. And I said that. I was like, I actually haven't used this yet. I did do a little research ahead of time because I knew they use this program. And I was like, I've read up on it. I know it's this. I said, honestly, I've never used it before, but I think it's great and I would love to learn more about it. Don't say you've used it or done it or know it or an expert at it if you're not. Be honest. And you can always say, hey, I'd be more than willing to learn whatever the XYZ thing is. I want to learn more about it. No, I don't know about it now, but I'd like to learn, do some training, that kind of a thing. You're not going to know everything, and that's okay. But again, be honest. On that note as well, the last thing I want to talk about is at the end of every interview, and this is typically in every interview I've sat in on as the interviewer or interviewee, they're going to ask you, do you have any questions for us? I know these interviews seem long, but I do highly recommend coming up with a few questions to ask. And I would even do this ahead of time. Now, obviously, as you're sitting in there in the interview process, you might think of some questions as you're sitting there. But even if you don't, it's good to have one or two. So especially, like I said, when you do that research, hey, they're really big into this. Maybe you have a question about that. Maybe you're wondering, what are they looking for from a candidate coming in? What are they looking for as a team? How do they collaborate with their teams? But you want to be thinking of a few questions you can ask them because it shows that you're taking interest and that you're curious and want to learn more about them as well, which is really important and good in an interview too. Next thing, and I put this in my last video as well, make sure you say thank you, make sure you dress professional. And at the end, I always like to try to send a thank you email to the people that were on the committee. As I mentioned in my last video, sometimes that can be a little hard to do if you can't easily find their emails, but if you can, I highly recommend it. A thank you goes a long way, and it's also a nice way to kind of continue to build that relationship that you started building with them in the interview process. I hope you found these tips helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to DM me over on my Instagram at teamjclassroomfun, or you can leave questions down in the comments below, and I'd be happy to answer them. Hope you have a great day. Happy job hunting.